Welcome to On the Other Hand. As a Utah resident, I've been following the Utah Senate midterm elections with interest, and now that the general election debate has happened, I'd like to recap my thoughts on the most interesting parts of that debate. But first, my bias. I'm a fan of Mike Lee. I've watched a lot of what he does, and I think he does a good job representing me and my state. Evan McMullin has also been on my radar, and has already flipped on some significant policy positions since his 2016 presidential run, as outlined in one of my earlier videos. So when I read op-eds like this one that says that McMullin has been bold and consistent in his positions and has never backed down or changed his stance for political expediency, my reaction goes something like this.
Crazy!
And because I've had my eye on this race, I want to pull up some articles that have been written leading up to this debate, so you can further understand my own bias and perspective. So McMullin kicked off his Senate campaign by saying that increasingly our values are under threat by political extremes and self-serving politicians. Senator Lee has lost his way in Washington and has become a poster child for the politics of division and extremism. Which is ironic to me, because when McMullin isn't calling his political opponents extremists, he's talking about how bad division is, and how it leads us to believe the worst of our political rivals. And McMullin calling others extremists isn't a one-time thing, which irritates me even more when I see op-eds from McMullin supporters touting that we finally have a candidate who's not interested in dividing us further or blasting the opposing party with hate and misinformation, or who seem to mock Mike Lee for sticking to principles. Yes, you heard me right, this McMullin supporter argues that a principled politician is a bad thing. So that's what was on my mind heading into this debate. I like Mike Lee, and I don't like McMullin's habit of calling for an end to division while simultaneously calling the people he disagrees with extremists. Now, let's jump into the debate itself. The debate was spicy. Honestly similar to the ads that have been running from both sides, so I'd definitely encourage you to go watch the original debate. And here I want to try and expand upon places where disagreements took place and try to give a breakdown of some of the context where I can. So a little bit into the debate, Lee said that federal spending is out of control, and McMullin agreed, then expanded on that as follows.
I also agree that the Biden administration is guilty of reckless spending. They were warned by both Democratic and Republican economists not to put in place the $1.9 trillion spending package during the pandemic that has contributed heavily to inflation in our country. Senator Lee, I'm glad you've stood up to that, at least in rhetoric. But the reality is we need to represent people. We need to send people to Washington who are willing to stand up both to Republicans and Democrats in the White House who are guilty of reckless spending, because the administration before Joe Biden, Donald Trump's, was guilty of the same. And frankly, no, Senator, I'm not quite finished. During your time in the U.S. Senate, when you were elected, the U.S. debt was about $12 or $13 trillion, Senator Lee. Now it's almost triple that. It's well over $31 trillion. I think our difference is in approach. I know that the only time we've ever gotten our fiscal house in order is when Republicans and Democrats have worked together. Senator Lee refuses to do that, and those are his broken politics.
Senator Lee, a quick 30-second rebuttal.
To suggest that I'm beholden to either party, that I've been a bootlicker for either party, is folly, and it's contradicted by the plain facts. Look, no member of the Republican Senate conference voted independently during the Trump administration than I did. Only two senators, Susan Collins and Rand Paul, voted less with President Trump than I did. I have stood against my party time and time again to oppose reckless spending. I will do it again and again and again. We need people to say no, because when Washington only wants to spend money, they're spending it at your expense. They're making you less powerful. They're making you more poor. That must stop.
So McMullin said that we need someone to stand up to both Democrats and Republicans in the White House who are guilty of reckless spending, and that during Lee's time in the Senate, the U.S. debt has almost tripled. You can make of their back and forth what you will, but I do want to put a pin in the idea that McMullin seems to be dissatisfied with how much debt has gone up since Lee has been in office, and seems to blame Lee, at least in part, for that increase. Now skipping over a bit, they both got this question on the 2020 presidential election, and here are their responses.
Did Joe Biden fairly win the 2020 presidential election? Senator Lee.
Yes, Joe Biden is our president. He was chosen in the only election that matters, the election held by the Electoral College. It was on that basis that I voted to certify the election results. The Electoral College cast its vote. Joe Biden won that. Now, as to whether there were errors, as to whether some states might have conducted their elections better than others, there's always room for debate and questions about that. Some people expressed concerns about the number of states using universal mail-in balloting for the first time in 2020. Unlike Utah, they hadn't tested it out. In Utah, we've got these signature verification protocols. We've got elaborate procedures for going through the voter registration rules to make sure that the wrong people who have died or moved out of state, aren't voting. In other states, there were open questions about that, about ballot harvesting and things like that. But ultimately, what matters is the Electoral College, and the Electoral College won. I would add here, it's absolutely essential that the authority to conduct elections remain in state hands, never consolidated in federal hands where the risk of corruption is great. On this, my opponent and I disagree. My opponent has expressed support for legislation backed by the Democrats called S1. S1 would consolidate excessive authority over elections in the federal government. It would do so, moreover, in a way that would virtually cobble the states in their ability to enact voter security measures like voter ID. This is a bad step. We should shun it like the plague.
Mr. McMullin.
Well, I certainly think it's important that we protect voters' rights and that we protect the peaceful transfer of power, Senator Lee. But for you to talk about the importance of the Electoral College, I think is rich. I think you know exactly how important it is. And I think you knew how important it was when you sought to urge the White House that had lost an election to find fake electors to overturn the will of the people. Senator Lee, that was the most egregious betrayal of our nation's Constitution in its history by a U.S. Senator, I believe, and it will be your legacy. Senator Lee is still casting doubt.
Please.
Look,
Ladies and gentlemen, you just took about 7 or 8 minutes away from the candidates. We're here to hear them.
Senator Lee, you advised spurious so-called legal efforts to mislead tens of millions of Americans that the election had been stolen. And congratulations, you succeeded. As recently as this year, and even tonight, you're still casting doubt on the legitimacy of the election. No, you're doing a tremendous disservice to this country, Senator Lee. You have betrayed your oath to the Constitution with this. It is and for this state, Utah, that was founded by people like my ancestors and yours, who sacrificed greatly to finally realize true freedom, for you to represent this state and to cast away, to abandon, to throw away 14 generations of American leadership, I think is a travesty.
Senator Lee, a 30-second rebuttal.
Evan, that's not true. You know that's not true. You, sir, owe me an apology. Listen. In the days leading up to January 6th, when the votes were going to be open and counted, I had a job to do. There were rumors circulating suggesting that some states were considering switching out their slates of electors. If that were true, I would need to know about it. I did research on that. I made phone calls to figure out whether the rumors were true. The rumors were false. On that basis, I voted to certify the results of the election.
Senator Lee, thank you.
Here I wanted to pull up some of the things that people often refer to when talking about Mike Lee in the 2020 election. There are some text messages between Mike Lee and Marc Meadows, President Trump's chief of staff, that were obtained and published earlier this year. The first text message centers around this statement on November 7th, 2020. Dear Mr. President, we, the undersigned, offer our unequivocal support for you to exhaust every legal and constitutional remedy at your disposal to restore America's faith in our elections. This fight is about much more than just this election. This fight is about the fundamental fairness and integrity of our election system. The nation is depending upon your continued resolve. Stay strong and keep fighting, Mr. President. Sincerely, Senator Mike Lee, and then a bunch of other politicians. Then there are some text messages later, on November 20th and 22nd, which a lot of people seem to reference, that say, please give me something to work with. I just need to know what I should be saying. And then, please tell me what I should be saying. There are a few of us in the Senate who want to be helpful, although I sense that number might be dwindling. McMullin specifically also referenced these sections of text sent on January 3rd that say, I don't think the President is grasping the distinction between what we can do and what he would like us to do. Nor do I think he's grasping the distinction between what certain members are saying that sound like they could help him, but would really hurt him. He's got a very real opportunity for a win in 2024. That opportunity could be harmed in multiple ways by this effort. Again, all this could change if the states in question certified Trump's electors pursuant to state law. But in the absence of that, this effort is destined to not only fail, but to hurt Trump in the process. Later, Lee again references states submitting electors pursuant to the law, and on January 4th there was this exchange from Meadows. Apparently he, Trump, was told that you, Mike Lee, came out with a letter against the electoral objections. I told him that you were being very helpful. Bad intel. Lee responded, I've been spending 14 hours a day for the last week trying to unravel this for him. To have him take a shot at me like that in such a public setting without even asking me about it is pretty discouraging. Those who oppose Lee take these messages to mean that Lee was just parroting whatever he was told from the White House, and that he was actively trying to commit treason and undermine the election by finding fake electors. While Lee and those who support him insist that these are consistent with Lee calling for an investigation into claims of fraud in the 2020 election, but ultimately recognizing Joe Biden as the president-elect and then voting to certify the election results on January 6th. You get to decide who you think has characterized all of that more accurately, but that's what was being referenced throughout that portion of the debate. Personally, I don't think that Senator Lee's conduct was the most egregious betrayal of our nation's Constitution in its history by a U.S. senator, as McMullin stated. Even if we look at Lee's actions in the absolute worst light possible, to say his actions were the most egregious in history is laughable. The United States has literally gone through a civil war where politicians literally committed treason that directly contributed to starting and continuing that war. This goes back to McMullin's habit of condemning his opponents as the worst people possible, like saying that Lee betrayed his oath to the Constitution, and that doesn't sit well with me. Now I want to move on to this portion where they discuss inflation as follows.
Who do you feel bears most of the responsibility for these higher prices? Is it the federal government, or is it large business, big corporations? And we start with Senator Lee this time.
In the late 1970s, the last time we saw a major raft of inflation, similar questions were asked to Milton Friedman, the aforementioned Nobel Prize-winning economist. He was asked, is it speculative investing? Is it trade unions? Is it international trade? What is it? And he said, in the United States of America, inflation has but one cause. It is federal spending, reckless, excessive federal spending. So it is Congress. It's Congress that's spent way too much. Now, it's been spending way too much for a very long time. And I've been a leading opponent of that excessive spending. But they've ratcheted it up to a whole new level. We thought it was too much cowbell before. They gave it 10 times the cowbell. As soon as the Democrats obtained dual control of the houses of Congress and the White House at the same time, they said yes to everything Joe Biden asked for. We brought in record-breaking revenue to the federal government last year. Over $4 trillion, more revenue than we've ever brought in the past. More revenue than just a few years ago the federal government spent in a whole year. And I'm talking Social Security to defense and everything in between. The problem is, while we brought in over $4 trillion, we spent nearly $7 trillion. This happened because Joe Biden had a dual backstop in Congress. What we need, now more than ever, is a Republican-controlled Senate. If you want that, and to bring inflation under control, I ask for you to vote for me.
Mr. McMullin.
Look, again, it is both parties. Where was Senator Lee when President Trump was spending recklessly during an expansionary period? Senator Lee will say that he was voting no. But I'll tell you what, it didn't work. We still added to the debt during that time. We're adding more now, and on and on and on. The job of a senator, especially representing our state, has to be to stand up to leaders of both parties, to Joe Biden and to Donald Trump. That's what's required, Senator Lee, because both parties are spending recklessly. And you vote no. And let me say, Senator, I think it's right that a senator should be willing to stand even alone and vote no. And you're very good at that. But you know what? It can't be the only thing you do. That's not the job of the senator. The job of a senator representing Utah is to work across party lines to solve problems. We have a legacy in this state of sending senators to Washington. Senator Bennett, Senator Hatch, now Senator Romney. They worked and work together across party lines to solve problems, Senator Lee. They don't only vote no, they're at the table negotiating a better deal for Utah and our country, and I'm committed to doing that on our spending and on every other issue.
Senator Lee, you've asked for a rebuttal.
Yeah, we've long had a problem where we've had at least 50 Democrats, all 50 Democrats, willing to vote for any amount of spending. And tragically, you've typically had at least 10 Republicans willing to cross party lines to vote for the Democrats' spending priorities. Look, I call out President Trump all the time. I voted less with President Trump than anyone else other than Rand Paul and Susan Collins. In fact, I called out President Trump about spending bills specifically, including one time when he called me on my airplane coming back to Utah, and I told him it was a huge mistake. I called him out in public and in private, on a train, in the rain, with a fox in a box, every time I got the chance.
There we go.
So here, where McMullin previously faulted Lee for being in office during a time when the national debt has risen so much, he says the voting on no more spending isn't enough, that you need to work across party lines. I think he means that you need to work across party lines to make the bills that pass less expensive, which I can see the argument, but if one tried to negotiate for lower spending and it didn't work, or the dollar amount wasn't low enough to vote yes on, then you are still part of the problem, according to McMullin. As far as I can tell by what he said, you can only win if you both compromise and get what you want, which seems contradictory to me. If Lee goes along with spending, he's part of the problem, and if he opposes it, he's still part of the problem. Seems like a catch-22 to me. There were several other back-and-forth questions that speak for themselves, but towards the end of the debate, McMullin criticized Lee for not denouncing third-party ads that McMullin says took his words out of context. And I'm sympathetic to this argument, but I've seen third-party ads against Mike Lee that took his voting record out of context, and McMullin describes those ads as fair. So it seems cynical to think attacks against the other guy were fair, but attacks against you were taken out of context, but that's just how I see it. So did you watch the debate? Who do you think is better or a more reliable candidate? I'd love to hear your thoughts below, especially if there's something I missed, or something that you see differently. As always, thanks, hope you enjoyed, and if you did, consider subscribing, or joining me on Odyssey, a great YouTube alternative. Link is in the description.